Amnesia: The Dark Descent is a survival horror video game whose roots could be traced back to the Gothic stories of the 19th century. Its story, in fact, takes place in the early 1800s in an ancient castle in Prussia. The main character, Daniel, wakes up in the castle without memories and finds a note written to himself describing his situation. He himself chose to lose his memories for reasons yet undisclosed. He is being followed by an unstoppable force, and he must travel to the belly of the castle to kill Alexander, the ancient baron who has resided in the castle for centuries.
Don't be afraid, Daniel. I can't tell you why, but know this. I choose to forget.
Amnesia has almost every element Robert Hume outlines as crucial to a Gothic story. 1. A setting in space or time, or both, sufficiently removed from the reader of 1800 that there would be no intrusion of everyday standards of factual probability and morality. 2. The action derives from a complex villain hero. And 3. The confusion of evil and good, which the Gothic novel reflects in its hero-villains, produces a non-Christian or anti-clerical feeling.
Hurry. No time to spare. You have to kill another. Alexander produces a knife. He wants me to cut the flesh. Do it. Save yourself. He is a murderer, Daniel. He is evil. A cold-blooded killer.
In particular, Amnesia shares the psychological interest of Gothic novels, which display the reactions of their characters in trying or appalling situations. The main tool Amnesia uses to rouse emotion in its player is terror, or suspense, and it uses it well. Several authors have drawn the connection between survival horror games and the Gothic genre, notably Laurie Taylor, whose article Gothic Bloodlines in Survival Horror Gaming discusses the ways survival horror gameplay transgress typical video game norms, which is in the spirit of the Gothic genre's tendency to transgress boundaries. She calls games like Amnesia the ludic Gothic, which simply refers to the Gothic in video game form. Another author, Simon Niedenthal, also draws the connection between survival horror and the Gothic, and he in particular chose to focus on the Sublime as developed by Edmund Burke. The Sublime, according to Burke, can be described as astonishment, awe, reverence, or respect, and terror is in all cases whatsoever either more openly or latently the ruling principle of the Sublime. While Niedenthal briefly explains the emotional connection between gameplay and player immersion, he falls short in describing the particular power video games have in creating a sense of terror in their players. This is partially due to his focus on basic elements such as light to construct his argument of the Sublime, and partially due to his literary method of description, which forces him to describe visual audio elements rather than provide them as they appear in the actual text. Gothic elements that create terror and emotion must be examined differently in interactive text than they are examined in literary Gothic texts, and when discussing terms common to Gothic discourse such as the sublime and the uncanny, the player's interaction with the story should be given more attention in Gothic video games. We could follow Neanderthal's example and outline the sublime elements of Amnesia according to Burke's work. These elements are 1. Obscurity, or fear of the unknown. 2. Power, or something that is capable of inducing pain or death. 3. Privation, which includes vacuity, darkness, solitude, and silence. 4. Vastness in both depth, length, and height. 5. Difficulty. 6. Light in great amounts. All of these elements appear in some form or another in Amnesia. As Neanderthal notes, obscurity has immense power in games of this sort. The inability to know when a monster may appear, the labyrinthine nature of the setting, and the lack of knowledge about the enemies the player faces all contribute to the overall sense of terror. In terms of power, almost all elements of the environment are more powerful than the player character Daniel, including both Alexander's monsters and the shadow following Daniel. Dan Pinchbeck mentions the prevalence of semi-deified manipulator characters in horror games. They move and manipulate the story and the actions of the characters and player, but they never appear in a battle, which would reduce their power to something the character could challenge. The same can be said of the shadow following Daniel, which cannot be challenged, only outsmarted with the blood of another, namely Alexander. Privation is the most immediately obvious of the sublime elements in Amnesia. We have all four of the aspects of privation, namely vacuity, darkness, solitude, and silence. In fact, privation is perhaps the most relevant to the actual story of Amnesia and to Daniel's frequent lapses in sanity. In particular, darkness plays an important role, as standing too long in darkness negatively affects Daniel's sanity. As Neanderthal notes, darkness is common in the Gothic genre, and there are multiple reasons for this, which Rebecca Stern examines in Gothic Light, Vision and Visibility in the Victorian Novel. On the most obvious level, darkness obscures threats that could do the character harm, but Stern posits that the terror it breeds runs deeper than that. She notes that light leads to and belays the illusion of a coherent self and of personal agency, which is a theory that she constructs through the psychoanalysis of Jacques Lacan. In other words, the absence of light not only creates a sense of vulnerability that anyone would experience when a monster could be lurking anywhere in the darkness, but it also breaks down Daniel's sense of subjectivity, as light has the property of fixing the subject as an object in space, of locating the subject as a visible and seen object. While this may seem far-fetched once we remember that Daniel has amnesia, which means that he has no memory of himself, or at least his recent self, we can see how this theory might hold in the context of his fragile sanity in darkness. Daniel already has a shaky concept of self, and the darkness serves to erase his visible existence as a person in space, or at least it serves to blur the boundaries between himself and everything else, a boundary that has already been dangerously blurred.
Focus. My name is... I am Daniel.
The other aspects of privation, in particular solitude, have bearing on Daniel's sense of selfhood and agency as well, which help to situate his lapses of sanity and the resulting loss of player control in terms of gameplay. As Kurt Reisler puts in The Social Psychology of Fear, a man's fear does not depend merely on his individual knowledge and ignorance. Within the universe of discourse, the knowledge of the others reassures my ignorance. The ignorance of others shakes my confidence in my knowledge. In other words, Daniel's lack of human contact with anyone else affects his fears, because his own ignorance cannot be relieved through discussion with someone who knows more than he does. Other than the letters scattered through the castle, Daniel's only mean of regaining his memories and selfhood are paralyzing flashbacks. This inability to know refers back to obscurity, an aspect of obscurity that Neanderthal failed to fully consider. Daniel's voluntary loss of memory brings up an aspect of terror that the Sublime does not cover, a source of terror that is also common to the Gothic genre, the uncanny. David Morris, in Gothic Sublimity, discusses the shortcoming of relying totally on Burke's Sublime to explain terror. Dirk proves deficient for an understanding of the Gothic novel because he rests his theory of terror on a narrow, mechanical account of bodily processes. In other words, Burke's conception of the sublime relies on the physical manifestations of terror, and the resulting cathartic release of exercising an emotion of the mind that does not get exercised often. Morris argues that Freud's theory of the uncanny is a more appropriate way to discuss the more psychological kinds of terror that do not concern the fear of pain or death. Fears such as those involving Daniel's willingly repressed memories. In fact, Freud's uncanny is created by the return of repressed thoughts, which he suggests can be sparked by events that recall primitive modes of thought such as superstitions or magic that seem to contradict our more modern rationalist ideals of what is or is not possible.
I assumed I would have to embrace the supernatural to save my mind and life. As a novice, I do everything in my power to stay focused and not dwell too much on my own doubts.
Or those that recall childhood complexes, such as the Oedipus complex. In Amnesia, the uncanny situations that are most prevalent go back to those that fall into the primitive beliefs that have been surmounted category, in particular with the orb and Alexander's use of pseudo-science to extend his own life. In fact, there is a pronounced vein of the Imperial Gothic in Amnesia, which can be discussed in light of Patrick Brantlinger's theory of the Imperial Gothic. Daniel's attraction to the orb, his turn towards torture, and the orb's path of destructions towards Daniel all speak towards an uncanny fear of regression into savagery and invasion of strange and foreign occult forces.
Enclosed in dark nothingness, I felt myself drawn to the mystic light.
Those fears associated with childhood complexes and states are also present in Daniel's righteousness in the torture he engages in, as it is suggestive of destructive impulses associated with the Oedipus complex and the id.
Please, I didn't do anything. Paint the man, cut the lines. Paint the man, cut the lines. Please, the man cries.
It is because of his guilt and horror in his own actions that he represses his memory, and his repressed memories create his own recurring sense of the uncanny throughout the game, which the player only sometimes shares. Up until now, we've discussed the story as we might discuss any Gothic text, focusing on the events of the narrative, the setting, and the characters, and Gothic theories of the uncanny and sublime as they might affect a character or viewer. As I said before, however, games cannot be treated the same way as a literary text due to the extra consideration of gameplay emotion and player goals. In fact, it is impossible to remove the player from the game. There is no game if there is no player, and it is a mistake to assume that anyone could talk about a game objectively without considering the actions of the player who moves the actions of the story. For that reason, I will be including my own reactions in the remainder of this analysis, as my own actions in the game affected its outcome, even if it was on a minor level. What do you mean it's locked with a simple lock?
On the barrel.
On the barrel. I'm not on the barrel. Many authors have considered the connection between gameplay and player emotion, including Bernard Perron. Perron builds on Tan and Frigda in his discussion of gameplay emotions. According to Perron, emotions are as much processes as states. In other words, emotions are a means of appraising a situation and then constructing a reaction to the situation. What do I do?
Probably shut the door.
Is he gonna come out? In most non-interactive fiction, emotions are empathetic, witness emotions as Perron calls them, since we cannot act on the emotions we have towards the protagonist or the situation. In games, however, we react to the situation, and our emotions expand to include evaluations of our coping potential and the actions we should take in response. Oh, Papa, what do I do?
He's not even coming to you.
I know he's not coming, but do I need to go in that room? Perron quotes Torben Grodel as saying, "It is the player's evaluation of his own coping potential that determines whether A, the confrontation with a monster will be experienced as fear, if the evaluation of his coping potential is moderate.
Oops.
Here we go. Despair, if he feels that he has no coping potentials. I can't do that. I failed. Or triumphant aggression, if he feels that he is amply equipped for the challenge. I killed it! These evaluations and the resulting emotions do not come from sympathizing with the character we play, but from evaluating our own goals and our ability to achieve them as active agents in the story. This pole is so wedged in this. How am I supposed to move this? Ekman and Lankowski's article, Hair-Raising Entertainment, Emotions, Sound, and Structure in Silent Hill 2 and Fatal Frame, expand on this idea of goal-related emotions and immersion into gameplay. According to these authors, emotions are part of decision-making that sometimes precede cognition. We feel before we think. Am I fine? I can't. Because decision-making is an important part of gameplay, which requires decisions to be made to advance the narrative and unlock new parts of the game, games are capable of arousing more urgent and immediate emotions in players than other fiction that rely on empathy rather than gameplay. The urgency and immediacy of emotions inspired by gameplay have a direct impact on the Sublime elements of Amnesia. Amnesia is so terrifying as a work of fiction not because the story itself is terrifying, though it is. Amnesia inspires terror because it is the player, not the character, experiencing the emotions that arouse fears of pain or death, if only virtually. Ekman and Lakowski discuss the ways video games create the personal connection to the game. They focus on sound as a means of creating the connection between character and player. Sound makes events more realistic, attracts attention to important events, and creates the illusion of the passage of time. Sound provides necessary information for decision-making, thus serves a functional role in achieving goals. Most importantly, perhaps, it is that sound connects the player's actions to the actions in the game. Ergo audition, hearing one's own action, a term borrowed from Chun. Playing with the sound can affect the player's feeling of control, a feeling that is important in the context of survival horror games such as Amnesia. In terms of the Sublime, we can now look at how the player might be affected differently than the player character or a reader of a traditional non-interactive text. The effect of darkness, silence, solitude, and vacuity have a different meaning for the player of Amnesia than it would otherwise. Dark stairway. I don't like you. For instance, when the silence is broken, sound cues the player into elements of the environment that affect their actions, such as the presence of a monster. An occasional subversion of these sound cues or surprising sound cues scare the player because it creates tension and suspense. The difference between light and darkness also has a particular effect on the player that is special and more immediate to their experience of the Sublime. Instead of the character moving through the darkness, it is us moving. And it is us who lose control when Daniel's insanity grows. Rebecca Stearns notes that darkness provides protection from being seen by the enemies the character seeks to avoid. And in light, people tend to engage in more self-policing due to the threat of being seen. As players, when we move through the hallways, we must strike a balance between the light and darkness so that we stay sane, but leave ourselves enough darkness to hide. When we have our torch out, we police our own actions, and the tension we feel in fear of getting caught is related to our own goals, not those of the character. When considering the player as an important element of a survival horror game like Amnesia, power becomes the most important aspect of the Sublime, not obscurity. Like Perron mentioned, we feel fear when we feel less powerful than our enemies. While obscurity is important in constructing the suspense we feel when skulking around the dungeons of Amnesia, it is our knowledge that we are powerless in defending ourselves from Alexander's monster servants that makes us most nervous. In the case of a game in which our ammunition were unlimited and our ability to fight unchecked, we would be alarmed by the sudden appearance of an enemy, but we would recover and dispatch it. Only the spooky atmosphere of the castle and the monstrosity of our adversaries would convince us to be frightened, and the ability of Amnesia to inspire the sense of the sublime in us would be significantly decreased. It is our powerlessness in the face of adversaries that makes Amnesia so scary, and the emotions that powerlessness induces are not related to Daniel's struggle, but to our own ability to achieve our goals within the context of the game. I was doing so well. No. While it is possible and relevant to discuss games like Amnesia in Gothic terms, discussions should include both the elements of the narrative that all fiction share, such as plot, setting, and characters, and gameplay elements that are unique to video games. Both are necessary to understanding the overall impact of the game, particularly with concerns to emotion. The elements of the sublime and the uncanny that affect Daniel are just as noteworthy as they would be in any other form of fiction, and we are affected by these elements as consumers of the story as well. In fact, in games like Amnesia, in which the sublime elements affect Daniel's sanity in ways supported by the narrative, which in turn affect gameplay and the emotions of the players in terms of goal-related emotions, which then creates a sublime-like terror in the player or on evaluative action level of emotion, it becomes prudent to discuss gameplay with elements of the narrative at the same time. That was scary. Me too, Daniel. Let's go over here. It may also be prudent to discuss video games and other audiovisual interactive texts in ways that retain the original character of the text, with all its audiovisual elements and the player interaction with the text included. What? Am I stuck here am I gonna die here? As stated before, unlike any other form of fiction, a video game must have a player in order to exist. So much so that the player becomes a part of the text itself. With this in mind, more rigorous examinations of games like Amnesia can take place, and a greater understanding of the limits and scope of emotion and genre, such as the Gothic genre, can be nurtured.